What makes a love theme a love theme? I decided to look at 8 different love themes from classical music and film music to answer that question. I think we can all recognize one when we hear it, but I wanted to go a step further and define a few of the salient features common to these classic themes. I'll go through each theme one at a time and make observations about each one, and at the end, I'll summarize what I believe to be the most important elements of a love theme. And in a follow-up video, using 10 steps, I'll write my own love theme. I'll start with one of my favorite melodies from the Romantic period, the Adagietto from Mahler's Fifth Symphony. This is perhaps one of, if not the most recognizable work by Mahler, and I read somewhere that he wrote this movement as a love letter to his wife, Alma. I've made a piano reduction of just the first statement of the theme, and obviously with a piano reduction you don't have everything that Mahler wrote, but that's okay. I tried to include what I thought was most important. I'm not going to talk about orchestration at all, as I think that there's plenty to discuss in just the notes and rhythms. But it's worth noting that this movement of the symphony was scored for just strings and harp. So let's start with a few obvious features of this music. The tempo, molto adagio, very, very slow. I listened to a few recordings of this piece to get a sense of the actual tempo in terms of beats per minute, and obviously that will change not only from conductor to conductor, but within the piece itself, the tempo will fluctuate quite a bit. Most of the recordings are in the 25 to 35 beats per minute range, which if you play that tempo with just piano, it sounds painfully slow. So next, the key. This is a tonal work and we're in F major. As I go through these different pieces, keep an eye out for whether a piece is in major or minor. I think that's going to be significant. What about the form of this melody? I'm interested in the following 3 things. 1. Repetition and variation. Is there a main idea that repeats, and does it evolve as it repeats? 2. Contour. What's the melodic shape? Does it ascend or descend? Are there patterns to how it moves up or down? And 3. Intervallic versus stepwise motion. When does Mahler move by step, and when does he move by a leap? And are those leaps at significant moments? So in terms of that first point, here's the basic idea. It features 3 pickup notes leading into the downbeat appoggiatura, basically an accented non-chord tone, that then resolves by step to beat 2. The basic idea is then repeated and shifted up, then repeated again and stretched to elongate the idea over 2 measures, then repeated and shifted up again, and repeated once more and extended into a cadence. So essentially we have a 1-measure basic idea that's repeated over and over again, but shifted or stretched each time. What can we take away from this point? Well, a lot of classical and romantic music uses similar methods for phrase structure, so I don't really see this as being unique to love themes. What about contour? There is definitely a pattern of alternating up and down melodic direction. It's very connected, not at all angular. In other words, the changes in direction either occur between phrases or right in the middle of an extended, stretched phrase. We could also look at an overall contour throughout the 8 measures. Here we see the melody start low and reach a high point in the 3rd statement of the idea, then work its way back down. So what can we take away from looking at the contour or shape of the melody? Well, I think we can sort of hear a push and pull, or rising and falling in the music. The idea of opposites, or contrast, or conflict and resolving tension is especially interesting here. Does this duality represent an aspect of love or romance? Does this represent something in Mahler's relationship with his wife? I'm not a historian, so I can't really say, but I think it's interesting to think about. A big part of writing an effective love theme is obviously the ability to elicit those emotional responses from the audience, and I think contour and melodic shape can certainly do that to some extent. What about stepwise versus intervallic motion? In this case, it's very much tied to phrase structure. The melody is mostly stepwise with a few small leaps, highlighted in red boxes here. Nothing greater than an interval of a fourth. They coincide with 8th note rhythmic values as well as changes in the direction of contour. I almost hear these moments as depictions of a sigh or a sense of relief from the conflict or tension. In fact, you can look at where the musical tension is at its peak, right here, It's all building tension using stepwise motion and elongated rhythms. Then the eighth note gesture, using leaps of thirds, triggers the relief from that heightened moment of tension. So that's sort of a brief overview of the melodic form. Keep in mind that this piece obviously continues on with subsequent statements of the melody, and how those statements are transformed would certainly be worth looking into. To keep this video short, however, I'll just focus on these few measures. Let's now look at note choices and harmony. The phrase begins here in F major with an accented non-chord tone on the downbeat. The seventh scale degree is briefly emphasized on this beat before resolving up to the tonic. This is really significant, I think. Incorporating the major seventh is a common feature of these love themes, as you'll see throughout this video. And when Mahler lands on this note on the downbeat and then moves up, he creates a really powerful emotional moment. I don't think a classical Roman numeral analysis here would really help most of my viewers, so I'll just mention a few other noteworthy harmonic and melodic moments. There are several instances of appoggiatura throughout either the seventh scale degree, the sixth, the fourth, or ninth scale degree. And that's just in the melody. There are other non-chord tone suspensions in the harmony. I think you'll agree that this, the suspension of non-chord tones, and the subsequent resolution, is one of the most significant features of this melody, and it goes back to that duality concept, the pushing and pulling. There are a few other noteworthy chords and harmonies. First, this moment. The minor ninth interval is the most dissonant moment in the phrase, and it really stands out each time I listen to the piece. There are also several interesting diminished chords, including right here. I didn't label this B-flat in the melody as an appoggiatura because technically the B-flat could form a half-diminished seventh chord against the harmony. Keep an eye out for that chord. It will show up several times in this video. But I think most theorists in this moment would indeed call it an appoggiatura as it resolves down to the A and the fully diminished chord. But the half-diminished chord also shows up earlier, right here. And one last thing, look at how long it takes to resolve this 4-3 suspension. It's not until the lead into the next phrase of the melody that we finally hear the E, the third, right here. So, with all of those things in mind, I'll play the passage finally. Apologies to my viewers who prefer to see the MIDI view. I played these pieces into Cubase without a metronome, so the notes don't align with the metric grid. I hope that this piano view will be okay. Moving on, this next example is very different. One of the things I enjoy most about studying music is when you can make connections between two pieces of music in completely different styles or from different eras of music. There are a few opportunities to make some interesting connections from Mahler to this next piece. So this love theme was written by the Greek composer and performer Vangelis for the 1982 film Blade Runner. The melody is performed on a saxophone with a synthesizer accompaniment. In fact, the saxophone is one of just a handful of acoustic instruments throughout the entire film. The majority of the soundtrack is performed by Vangelis himself on various synthesizers. I decided to make a lead sheet style score for this melody as I think it gives us all of the information we need. Obviously, this piece differs from the Mahler in several ways. It's written as a soundtrack for a film, and of course the instrumentation and scope of the piece is much different. If you haven't seen this movie, by the way, I recommend it, and knowing the context for this piece of music really helps in appreciating and understanding the composer's intentions. The film is a dystopian futuristic sci-fi with elements of film noir, especially in parts of the soundtrack. So how does Vangelis capture the idea of love in the world of Blade Runner? Well, let's look at some of the same types of musical elements as before, starting with tempo. I wasn't looking at a written score when I transcribed this, so I don't actually know if the music is written with these rhythmic values or if it's written at double tempo. It would, of course, sound the same either way, but listening to the recording, this is how I thought the music should be written, and if so, the tempo would be about 35 beats per minute, so very similar to the Mahler. But, like the Mahler, it fluctuates quite a bit. I recommend listening to the original soundtrack recording. The beats or rhythms are actually quite difficult to count because of the rubato nature of the saxophonist. The ambiguity in tempo creates a dreamlike effect that fits with this film extremely well. In terms of tonality, we're in the key of D flat, and it's interesting that the melody starts on the 4 chord. I'll discuss chords in just a bit. We're in a major key, so that's another similarity with the Mahler. What about melodic form? I'll divide the 8-measure melody into 2 4-measure halves. The first half can also be divided in half with a 2-measure idea that repeats. The basic 2-measure idea features the repetition of the B flat in the first measure and the resolution to A flat in the second measure. Like the Mahler, there's also 3 pickups to the downbeat. I'm not sure if that's a common feature of love themes, but I thought it was interesting. So after the basic idea, we get a repetition with just some slight ornamental variation in the melody. My transcription here is not 100% accurate, as the saxophonist embellished the line with scoops and bends and various jazz inflections, but essentially it's the same 2 measures repeated. And then the second half of the melody slowly descends by step downward to the tonic D flat in the 8th measure. The overall contour is much simpler than the Mahler. Basically, it's fairly static in the first half and moves down consistently in the second half. So not really a similarity to Mahler. However, this melody is completely stepwise, and the Mahler was for the most part as well. So we'll keep that in mind as a possible trend in the melodic shape of love themes. We're working with a much different harmonic language here. Obviously, comparing music written 80 years apart is difficult, simply because music has changed so much in that time. Plus, this piece and the Mahler were composed for very different purposes. With all of that said, there are some similarities to point out. So in the Mahler, all of those non-chord tones were a big part of the overall sonic landscape of the piece. Even though for the most part those tension notes resolved up or down, they helped establish a harmonic vocabulary for the piece. Well, in this Blade Runner love theme, those same non-chord tones like the major 7th, major 9th, and major 6th, which I'll switch to calling the 13th, are present throughout. A major part of the jazz harmonic language is letting those extended harmonic notes be a part of the chord without needing to resolve. The definition of the tonic chord has thus sort of changed. As you see here, the tonic chord is a D-flat major 9th chord, so the 7th and 9th scale degrees are present. At the end of the day, however, to put it rather bluntly, we're hearing a lot of the same notes and chords here as we were in the Mahler, but in a very different context. I think that's interesting and may play a major role in how we define a love theme, or romantic music in general. So let's give this a listen. I just improvised a left hand using the chords, so it obviously won't sound exactly like the soundtrack recording, and of course the saxophonist is capable of different articulations and inflections than the piano. The next theme is from a film made just 2 years prior to Blade Runner, and one also featuring the actor Harrison Ford. This is Han Solo and the Princess, the love theme between Han Solo and Leia from the Star Wars sequel The Empire Strikes Back, with music by John Williams. This has always been one of my favorite film score melodies, and I've always felt that it captured so perfectly their passionate yet turbulent relationship in that film. Let me start this time by playing through the piano reduction. In 4/4 time, the same as the previous two pieces. We're in D-flat major, the same as Blade Runner. So is there something about the key of D-flat major that works particularly well for love themes? Well, perhaps. The tempo is slow, but not quite as slow as the previous examples. The soundtrack recording varies between about 60 and 72 BPM, and it also seems to pick up as the piece gains momentum. That's much later in the piece, not shown here. Let's look at the melodic form. So the phrase structure is just slightly different than the previous two examples. This melody features a 2-measure basic idea that is repeated in measure 3, but chromatically altered. These 4 measures form a complete phrase, sort of like a call and response, where the first statement presents the main idea, as well as the main harmonic conflict, and the second statement takes us chromatically back to the tonic to resolve that conflict. The main difference between this melodic structure and the previous two examples is that the second phrase here, starting in measure 5, opens again with the same idea, which was not the case in the others. You may have heard the terms presentation and continuation, or antecedent and consequent, terms from music theory. I'd rather not spend too much time on labels, as I think we tend to overemphasize them, but essentially this second 4-measure phrase starts with the same idea, but extends that idea towards the cadence without splitting into 2-measure units. In terms of melodic contour, there isn't as clear of an overall shape. The melody sort of sits consistently in the same spot, registrally the entire time. Partly that's due to the chromatic nature of the melody. Much of the tension is caused by shifting things up by a semitone, one direction or another, which ends up not creating that significant of a melodic contour over an extended period of time. Instead, we could look at how these 2-measure units are shifted up or down. Notice the first downbeat in each group of 2 measures here. It starts on F, then the next 2 measures feels like a chromatic shift downward to D, then back up to F, then up to A natural near the end. So the highest note comes at the climactic moment of the phrase, which is often the case. We can also get a good sense of just how chromatic this melody is by looking at the contour formed between these notes, which are all important structurally within the melody. Extracting these notes, we get this. Not only is the contour very clear, this illustrates the heavy use of chromaticism. What about stepwise versus intervallic motion? Perhaps the most recognizable aspect of this melody are the leaps that begin the basic idea. Neither the Mahler nor the Vangelis really featured large leaps, although each of those themes featured pickups into the first measure, as is the case here. I think pickups, and especially pickups featuring leaps, will be important in our summaries at the end of this video. In my opinion, I've always been drawn to these love themes that begin with a large leap. Perhaps in my mind, I associate or compare the distance of such a leap with the struggle or tension within the on-screen relationship or love affair. So in this case, the major 6th interval seems like quite a large leap, and you could argue that this interval represents a romance between 2 extremely unlikely individuals, and their relationship won't be easy. There are 2 other notable leaps, and you'll notice that they sort of balance out the opening ascending leaps by returning in the opposite direction. Again, this push and pull concept, tension and resolution. It's proving to be a major feature of these themes. So just a quick look at the harmonic language for this piece. I've already mentioned that it's very chromatic, but one of the ways in which we don't feel that chromaticism as intensely is through the use of a pedal note, this pedal D flat, that continues until the 6th measure. In the 3rd measure, we have this really interesting moment harmonically. The tonic chord of D flat major is chromatically shifted up to D major. However, the D flat, which I've now labeled as C sharp, is still the lowest note. Thus, we don't get that brightening effect that typically might accompany an ascending chromatic shift. And on top of that, even though the chord is ascending chromatically, the notes are voiced down from the previous chord, so it's this interesting case that feels both descending and ascending, depending on how you look at it. In measure 6, we get the same shift from a D-flat key area to a D natural key area, but this time the bass notes change as well, which coincides, of course, with the extension of the melodic phrase and the push towards the end. One last chord I want to point out right here. I mentioned how the half-diminished chord was important in the Mahler. Well, here's a half-diminished chord as well. This is proving to be an important chord in love themes, I think. The next example is also from the Star Wars saga, this time from the 2002 Attack of the Clones. The piece is called Across the Stars, and it's a love theme between Anakin Skywalker and Padme Amidala. It's sort of your classic Greek tragedy, a story of forbidden love that ultimately ends in sorrow. It's no wonder that John Williams chose a minor key for this piece. We're in D minor, and with the exception of the first measure in 12/8 time, we're in 9/8 time. The reduction here is from the first statement of the melody, where oboe has the melody to start, with other woodwinds joining oboe in measure 10. The bottom two staves here are a reduction of the strings. I'll go ahead and play a piano version of this first statement of the theme. I'll start with melodic form and phrase structure. The first measure starts with a leap up to F and then down a minor third to D. The descending third interval is important in the melodic form as it appears several times in succession, sort of extending the first phrase all the way to measure 5 on the A. So the first phrase is 5 measures and features a basic idea that is extended by fragmenting part of that idea and shifting it down several times. The second phrase opens with the same basic idea for measure 1, then extends that fragment upwards once to the cadence. The second half of the melody is completely contrasting material, so we don't get a return of the basic idea, not until the next statement of the theme, which I'm not showing here. Measure 10 starts with a 2-measure contrasting idea, which is followed by a repetition that seems to cadence on the D major chord here. But Williams takes measure 10 and repeats the whole thing, shifting up by a perfect fourth. The real cadence then is in the last measure here, on the G chord, which will lead to C minor in the measures that follow. Let's look at contour from phrase to phrase, so not worrying about stepwise neighbor tones, but on a bigger scale. It appears that the first two phrases from measure 1 through 9 are sort of opposites, with the first starting with a leap up and then slowly moving its way back down to the first note. The next phrase then works its way back up the octave to the high A and then drops down to lead into the next phrase. And I already discussed that the second half takes the first 4 measures and shifts it up a fourth. Within each of these second half phrases, the melody doesn't really have a strong contour. It sort of goes down, then up, then down, then up, and so on. So is there anything interesting in any part of this contour? Well, I think having looked at several love themes now, I think there might be a trend with having melodies that travel a great distance over several measures in terms of register. These first 9 measures seem to move slowly but deliberately across an octave with a clear direction. The same was true with the Blade Runner love theme, and to a certain extent the Mahler as well. So what about important intervals? Well, certainly the opening interval of a sixth, very similar to the other John Williams love theme, only now a minor sixth instead of a major sixth. Also, I already mentioned the third that appears in the main idea over and over again. It's even a way to connect the second half melodically to the first half, especially coupled with the dotted quarter note rhythm nearly each time. There are a few other leaps, including that octave that ends the first half, but mostly the rest is stepwise. Still, of all the examples so far, this clearly has the most leaps in the melody. In terms of harmony and harmonic form, the first half of the melody is very much diatonic, starting in D minor, moving to G minor, to A minor, B flat major, F major, and the dominant A major. All very simple diatonic chords until we get to this chord here, which is technically the Neapolitan chord or flat 2 chord, but it doesn't really function like a typical Neapolitan chord, and in some ways it's preparing us for the modulation in measure 10 and 11 to G minor. I've already mentioned the shift upwards by a fourth in measure 14, so that's kind of a direct modulation to C minor, with the half cadence on G major at the end of this passage. One other interesting chord to point out, Here's that half diminished 7 chord again. It starts as a G minor chord, then Williams adds the E, creating the half diminished chord. Or depending on how you label it, it could be a G minor 6th chord. Overall, I can't help but notice just how classical this theme is in construction. Voice leading, harmonic progression, really everything about it. I think it fits given the Greek tragedy type of romance between the characters. It's fitting that their love theme sounds classical. So I have a few more themes to look at. I'm going to go through the next 2 very quickly, as I'm more interested at this point in finding patterns as opposed to doing another thorough analysis. Next up is from the 1960 movie Spartacus with music by Alex North. I'll quickly point out a few things to listen for, patterns or common musical devices that have shown up so far in these examples. First, the pickups. We've seen pickups, especially pickups with a ritardando, or in this case fermatas, that lead into the downbeat of the theme. Also, the opening leap. Similar to both John Williams themes, the first thing we hear is an important interval. This interval shows up quite frequently throughout the melody, so clearly it's a major component of this theme. Also take note of the chord qualities, a lot of sevenths, both major and minor, as well as a 9th chord right here. In terms of melodic form, notice that the first half is all based on the opening basic idea, and then the second half starts with a new idea in a new key area, somewhat contrasting from the initial idea. Notice this chord here, another example of a half diminished 7 chord. This time, however, that chord is part of the cadence, and that cadence is very similar to the Across the Stars cadence, with a very similar descending melody as well. Both themes, after all, are in a minor key. So with all of that in mind, let's listen to this theme. I've just improvised a left-hand accompaniment here on piano. The next theme is from the 1968 film Romeo and Juliet with music by Nino Rota. This is the only example that is actually a song, meaning there are lyrics to be sung. But in terms of the melody itself, let me point out just a few quick things that I think are significant. So first, we have yet another theme with pickups to the measure. Not only that, but we have an interesting contour here. Essentially, the entire basic idea is this pickup material plus the downbeat note. That basic idea is repeated and adjusted throughout most of the theme until the last form measures, where we get some contrasting material that cadences and ends the theme. The use of large leaps is significant throughout this melody, with thirds and fourths scattered throughout, and the climactic high note right here approached by a large leap. Also, the second to the last measure here is reminiscent, at least to my ears, to the final cadence in the previous 2 examples, Across the Stars and the Spartacus love theme. It has a leap up by a minor 6th, then a stepwise descending gesture. I'm sure there are other patterns here to take note of, but let me play this piano reduction and perhaps you'll notice other similarities to previous examples. The final example for today is actually comparing 2 different pieces of music. The first excerpt is from the Prelude to Wagner's opera Tristan und Isolde, composed between 1857 and 1859. If you're not familiar with this opening prelude, it features a very well-known progression of chords starting here. In fact, in the classical music world, this chord is often referred to as the Tristan chord. Some other things to pay attention to: each statement of this idea opens with this large interval, a sixth. But other than that opening leap, the rest is for the most part very stepwise and chromatic, similar to the Han Solo and Princess theme, where that melody was extremely chromatic. This difference here, though, is that the harmonies underneath are also very chromatic, so the end result is very dissonant in comparison to the John Williams theme. Wagner repeats the opening idea 3 times in total, and then repeats fragments of the idea several times before the final statement that leads us to this fortissimo moment, where we finally get some sense of tonic and stability. Wagner is taking that concept of tension and resolution to the extreme here. Also notice the top note right here is the B natural, which is the raised 4th scale degree over the F major chord in the left hand. So overall, this passage is intensely chromatic with a rising motion, building in anticipation and intensity all the way to the F major chord. It also features that Tristan chord as well as the raised 4th scale degree of a major chord. I'll play the passage now, obviously just a piano reduction of the full orchestra. Now I want to compare this piece to the next example, a cue from the 1958 film Vertigo, with music by Bernard Herrmann. This piece, Scene d'amour it's called, shares a few very significant musical connections to the Wagner. Of course, it's worth mentioning right away the pickups to the downbeat. At this point, I'd be curious to find a love theme that starts on the downbeat. That'd be interesting. Also notice here the D natural over an A flat major chord in the left hand. That's the raised 4th scale degree, the same as the last measure of the Wagner excerpt. Also notice the leaps. Here are a few fifths. There are some other intervals as well, but for the most part the melody is very stepwise, with quite a bit of chromaticism as well. Also, the chords underneath the melody feature a lot of minor seconds, and the harmony to my ears is intentionally a bit ambiguous, as though Herrmann purposefully left out a note of the chord each time, so you can't tell if it's a major 7th chord or a minor chord with an added minor 6th. Also, the overall contour and melodic form is quite clear throughout. It features a 2-measure basic idea that is repeated and shifted over and over again. Herrmann shifts this idea down and back up and then upwards to a climactic high note right here, before working its way back down to the end of the melody. I also included a reduction of the woodwind chords that occur right after the string melody, as they contain very similar chords to the Wagner, including the Tristan chord, although the top G sharp is doubled down the octave here, so it's not exactly the same chord, but close enough, I think. Let's listen to the Scene d'amour, obviously in piano instead of strings and winds. Listen for any other similarities between this and the Wagner, or just this and other love themes that I've discussed today. So I've looked at 8 different love themes, and I think it's time to summarize my thoughts on what makes a love theme a love theme. Number 1, most of the tempi are somewhere between very slow and medium. That could be anywhere from roughly 30 or 35 beats per minute to about 72, 76 beats per minute. Number 2, most time signatures will work, 4/4, 3/4, and even compound time signatures like 6/8 or 9/8 will work fine. I would avoid irregular time signatures like 5/8 or 5/4 or 7/8 or something like that. Number 3, both major and minor keys are okay, and there are some common features of each. In major keys, major sevenths and major ninths are very common additions to the tonic chord, and the half-diminished seventh chord is also commonly used in contrast with the major tonic chord. In minor keys, the harmonies tend to be more simple, resembling a more classical sound. I think the major or minor keys tell us a lot about the nature of the love or romance depicted in the film or opera or story or whatever. Minor keys tend to reflect a darker, more troubling or tragic love story than major keys. Okay, number 4, basically all of these themes started with pickup notes leading into the first downbeat. Some of them also used rubato or fermatas to really exaggerate the tempo going into the downbeat. Number 5, another common feature of love themes, the large leap that contrasts with the otherwise stepwise melody. Often this leap will be of at least a fifth in size and will show up either in the pickup measure or very early in the basic idea. Number 6, the first phrase of the melody is typically built from a simple 1 to 2 measure basic idea, and the rest of the first phrase is often built from that very same idea, repeated but shifted registrally. After the first phrase, we typically have contrasting material that builds towards a climax. The contrasting material is sometimes based loosely on the opening basic idea, but typically not in exact version. The registral shape of this second half of the melody is important, and is usually either consistently directed up or down, leading to the cadence. Next, number 8, the overall form of the melody should be simple and balanced, based on a well-thought-out structure of repetition, fragmentation, and expansion. This is obviously not unique to love themes, as most themes in classical music or classic film music use a similar structure. I'm just pointing out here that love themes aren't using some vastly different type of form or structure. Number 9, the harmony underneath the melody can be diatonic, chromatic, or even somewhat ambiguous in the case of Wagner and Hermann. Harmonies featuring diatonic chords often include extended harmonies like 7th, 9th, and 13th chords, which can often blur the lines between styles, like between classical and jazz. And lastly, and most importantly, number 10, the theme should present a conflict with tension, possibly a sense of anticipation, and then resolution of that conflict. The concept of conflict and resolution can manifest in many different ways, including through the pushing and pulling of contour, or through consonance versus dissonance, or in many other ways, but it should be obvious. I think that's what makes a love theme effective at capturing these emotions. It's clear to the listener even if it's subconscious. And how big of a conflict you create depends obviously on the narrative or the characters for which the music is based on. Not all love stories are tragic, but most contain some sort of tension that's worth investigating in the music. So that's my summary. I'm certain that I've left out some important features or ideas, and please let me know in the comments if you think there are other common elements to musical love themes. Also let me know what your favorite love themes are. They could be from film, classical music, anything really. I'm of course focused mostly on orchestral or cinematic love themes, so that doesn't include pop songs or ballads, anything like that. That would be a completely different topic, I'm sure. So my next video will be a continuation of this, where I use these 10 steps to write a love theme from start to finish. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and see you next time.